Hi everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Jacques Baud, a retired colonel in the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service, to discuss, I guess, primarily what is happening in Europe with these drones from Russia entering Poland, if we're entering a new stage of this war. So, let me start by welcoming you back to the program.
Thank you very much for inviting me again.
Well, I thought start off with I guess as a wider question. I mean, do you think we have already, to some extent, entered World War III? I know this sounds very hyperbolic, but it does appear that the time we're living in, this transition from unipolarity to multipolarity, it's becoming a source of much of our conflicts. That is, in the West, we seem to only accept one civilizational model, suggesting that everyone has to follow this model. And while China, Russia, Iran, India, the others seems to be working on a very different premise. Um, so again, it's a very different idea of what actually creates security. That is, um, from what we see these efforts in Eurasia, the premise appears to be that security means that the different centers of power seek to harmonize interest, overcome challenges, and but in the West, we often use the language that even talking to these other centers of power is unacceptable because they violate the universal ideals which we have put forth. And so the language translates into language such as we can't work with dictators, and yeah, we're all familiar with this. But in short, it seems that our commitment to liberal democracy as universal values is linked to the preservation of hegemony, which means there can only be one civilizational model. And I think this is why we have all these conflicts now, because when, for example, the countries in the East are meeting, as they did in China, uh, to diversify away from the West, the first instinct is that this is almost a conspiracy against the West. It's aggressive, so the conclusion is has to be punished or prevented. But this is simply in national interest. If you see all these countries, they see the West becoming, their economic model becoming less sustainable, more weaponization of economic dependence. So it appears that what we want to pressure them to do is to act against their own national interest. So you end up with these tensions which can't be resolved. It's a very long question, but I guess for this reason, it appears to be a common thread across all of the conflicts which we in the West are now involved with. And it does appear that this is the very bumpy transition from this hegemonic era to the multipolar era. So also just wondering, we don't have to call it World War III, but how do you see how do you see this transition possibly being resolved without ending up in a massive direct war between the great powers?
Oh, yes. Thank you. That's a complex question. But first of all, the first point is, how do you define war? Obviously, what we have in mind when we see war, it's bombers, tanks, infantry, and all that. We are probably in some kind of war, but probably not exactly the kind of war we used to have in World War II, even if what we are witnessing today may evolve in something like that. But let me allow me to be optimistic and think that we will not go towards this evolution. However, what we're witnessing today is the collapse of the Western world. There's no question about this. This collapse is because, in fact, this is a result of our hegemony. We have built up our own collapse somehow. Um, the example is probably the United States, although to some extent this applies to Europe too. This is the United States used to be the engine of the Western world after World War II, and even before, in fact, but especially after World War II. They were the ones who developed technology. They had a huge industrial production. They were providing us with concrete products and all that. And since about 40 years, 30, 40 years, they started to use extensively uh, other countries such as China, India, Southeast Asia, and so on, to make production. And the US stopped to be a production country, and their industry starts to fail, to collapse a little bit. And they became a financial, I mean, the US economy is, let's say, guided by financial engineering rather than by industrial engineering. As a result, it is still a huge power when it comes to the GDP, but it's no longer a huge power in terms of what it can produce and what it can offer to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has, in turn, it has learned from that. It has developed its own industrial capacities, and today, what we have since about 15, 20 years, is China as the engine of a second part of the world, if you want. So the Western engine is fading away while the Asian engine is developing quite rapidly. And that's what was needed to help the collapse of the Western world. Our hegemony, since probably the 17th century or so, where we started to have colonies and exploit colonies and all that was based on our ability in the West to innovate, to create, to produce, and to, in fact, to be the the general store of the planet, if you want. And the fact that we outsourced our production abilities and capabilities made other countries then more able than us to produce, create, and innovate. And as an example, today we have China as the main patent producer for every year. So we have now a second world that has its own autonomy. During the last 50 years or so, nobody dared to confront the West because it had the ability to intervene militarily, economically, through sanctions, through that, and that made the rest of the world dependent on the West. But today, with this new engine that China is, the rest of the world can afford to say to 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 confront the West. And that's exactly what we have seen in the last 10 years or so. That all the initiatives of the West, especially after what we had at the turn of the 2000s, the year 2000s, where we started to have wars all around, wars against terror, a war against dictatorship, wars against whatever it is. We disrupted societies, we destroyed societies without even gaining much from on ourselves. Then the rest of the world understood that and understood that probably the West is not acting for the benefit of all, but just for the benefit of themselves. And we have now this, it's exemplified by the BRICS, but not the only. We have the SCO that gathered recently in China, that shows that the rest of the world now understands that the West is no longer someone who can provide them with, let's say, benefits, But probably China is more likely to be the engine of the world for the future. And that's what we have now. But beside this, also qualitative difference. Because when we talk about Ukraine, Palestine, all these conflicts, we see that the West has retained this idea of hegemony through force, hegemony through confrontation. And they had the ability to impose themselves to the rest of the world by the use of force. And what we see as a response from the rest of the world is, instead of having, uh, let's say, security by confrontation, they shift towards security through cooperation, which is in fact what the Soviets at the time, when they created the Helsinki process that led to the CSCE and then OSCE, that was the whole idea, and that is still the idea of the Russians, to have another model for having international relations, not based on confrontation, but on cooperation. And that's the reason why, by the way, this explanation for the name of the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. But it was always the model of the Russians, that they took from the Soviets at the time when the Soviets realized that they could not, they didn't want to compete militarily with the West because it was extremely expensive. And probably it would lead to a confrontation that would be not just expensive economically, but also in human lives. And remember that Soviet Union has spent 25 million of lives during World War II. So it's certainly not an experience they want to repeat. And therefore, this idea, and remember, Pacific coexistence was a concept developed in the 50s by Khrushchev from the Soviets. It didn't come from the West. So the West had always this view of, because they had technology, because they had money, because they had the capacities, so they could afford to have a security based on confrontation. The others tried to manage, but it led. Eventually, that's exactly what led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, in fact. This is the huge amount that was devoted to physical security. And that's probably what the Soviets have identified very soon, and the reason why they preferred a model of international relations based on cooperation that would escape the arms race and all these things that are extremely expensive and for nothing at the end of the day. And we have, by the way, besides the whole issue of the SCO and BRICS and other fora related to the cooperation within the rest of the world, we can see also this idea of cooperation if we talk about the security guarantees about Ukraine, for instance, because that's very much an example, a practical example of this concept of security by cooperation in the vision of the Russians, not in the vision of the Western powers, who are still in this model, is this confrontational model. So what we have seen in the SCO, and that's very interesting to see that the SCO was the opportunity to have India and China talking together about border issues, about their issues, and provide a platform for solving conflicts. And SCO, by the way, it's something that most media have uh, uh, forgotten in observing what happened in China a couple of days ago. SEO was a platform created by China in order to solve water issues with Central Asian countries. So basically, it's a conflict resolution platform that is based on dialogue and negotiation. And this is probably not a coincidence if you have now more and more countries who are interested in joining this platform, because it provides an opportunity to solve problems by avoiding force or the use of force. And we have exactly the opposite in the West. We have seen the conflict in Ukraine is a case in point, because instead of trying to solve the problem before it happened, because we know that since 2014, 15, sorry, with the Minsk agreement, that this conflict in Ukraine was brewing very slowly and could erupt in something more consequential, as it did in 2022. But we knew that. But the Europeans never tried and never pressed and never uh, um, uh, uh, influenced or tried to influence the Ukrainians to implement this agreement, because we wanted this confrontation with Russia. And this is probably not also a coincidence to have people such as Kaya Kallas, who comes from one of the smallest countries from Europe, which is a net recipient of European aid to survive, which is a tiny country, but which is one of the most anti-Russian from all the the Eastern European countries. That she's Kaya Kallas is now the foreign minister, and we see that this the all her attempt, I mean, all her activities, not attempt, she didn't attempt anything, but all her activities is always directed against Russia. It seems that she has only one word in mind. This is Russia. And this is a good example of this Europe that has not understood that the world has changed, and that Ukraine now is paying the price for this, and probably having a position because, as I always said, if you're Ukrainian, you fight as a Ukrainian. If you're Russian, you fight as a Russian. But if you are a European, why should you be involved directly in the conflict? Why can't you have this uh, position as the one who can mediate between the two? This is definitely something we missed here in Europe. This uh, position of outsider that could have led to a mediation. We never did that. On the contrary, we sided with Ukraine in the conflict, and we are almost a direct participant to the conflict. I said almost because there are obviously Western European military deployed in Ukraine, more for staff purposes than actual troops. But anyway, so we are actors of the conflict. And this exemplified this inability of the West to understand international relations outside of the use of force. We have kept this confrontational stance, and the rest of the world, in fact, what we have with the BRICS and all that, it's not something that aims at confronting the West. If we listen carefully and if we look at the measures they've taken, it's a defensive structure that tries to escape the use of the dollar, not because they don't like the Americans, but because the dollar, that used to be a symbol of strength, of economical strength in the 60s, 70s, and so, has become today a vulnerability for these countries, because then they become vulnerable to sanctions. Therefore, they try to get rid of this of the dollar in their day-to-day transactions, but also probably in their let's say monetary reserves. in order to escape the constant pressure of the West. And what we have seen with the US, for instance, in fact, it is exactly the same activity or the same, let's say, mindset as we had before. The difference between Trump and his predecessor is that instead of using military force, he preferred to use trade as a weapon, and the access to market, especially access to the U.S. market, as a weapon. And this weaponization of economy has pushed the rest of the world even further together, because they they see that there is no future in having in trading with partners who are not reliable, who can change their mind overnight, and who can use their economic and trade advantage to destroy you. And that's exactly the problem we are facing today. This is, in fact, what we are witnessing is not just a change in geopolitics, it's a paradigm change. That you have now the rest of the world understanding that they need to protect themselves from the West, because the West has not provided them with the prosperity. In fact, all the immigration we have in the West now is the product of our inability to create stability in the rest of the world. We have made the rest of the world totally unstable. And that's the reason, if you look at those who come, the migrants who come to Europe in the last years, they come from Afghanistan, they come from Libya, they come from Iraq, they come from Syria, all these countries that we have destabilized for reasons that nobody really knows, because I'm not a Taliban, and I'm certainly not in any way related to the Taliban. But on the other hand, I say, why are we so keen to change the regime in Afghanistan? What, why are we ready to disrupt complete regions just for the sake of changing the regime in Afghanistan? If they don't like the regime, we did that in Europe when the Europeans were not happy with monarchy. They they made revolutions and they toppled the monarchies. They did that by themselves. We didn't need the help of the Afghans to do that. So today, why should we go there and make decisions instead of themselves? We have done the same in Libya with disastrous effect. I'm very often, I spent many years in Africa, and I spent sometimes in North Africa, in Mali, especially. And when I talk to Malian people, officials, they always said, well, the French have completely destabilized the region. They have introduced, it's after 2011, when Gaddafi was toppled, that you had the development of some Islamist groups in the region, which, by the way, were not completely Islamist, but were most probably tribal uprising that were, in fact, portrayed in the West as Islamist, although they had certainly some Islam motivation. But it's not the main thing. They were mostly they were mostly ethnically related. But in any case, the fact that we completely destroyed Libya and the leadership in Libya has created a void in this region that has allowed the instability to, and the country is not stable yet after about 15 years. So we have completely destroyed the region. We have done the same in Iraq. The whole Iraqi issue led to the Syrian problem, led to the Kurdish problem, led to the situation with Iran. Afghanistan is the same thing. So we have just destabilized the whole world. And now we pay the price because the migrants are coming in the place where they can live because we made life impossible in their own region. So we see that the West, by misunderstanding the way the world works and by overestimating the ability to influence the rest of the world, have completely disrupted international relations, have completely disrupted the relations between us and the rest of the world. And now the rest of the world try to protect themselves from us. And this is exactly what we are witnessing. And in a more diplomatic way in China recently, and this spectacular rapprochement between, I mean, it was in the pipeline already. It came to the surface a couple of days ago, but this rapprochement between India and China, but also India, China, put the Russia and North Korea. And now we see that those countries are more united as ever. And they are not just united in geostrategic terms, but they're also united in economic and trading terms, making then this area becoming slowly the this is probably not in their mindset, but that will be de facto the future hegemon of the world.
One of the interesting, yeah, you had to say in order to justify not regime changing or going to war with Afghanistan that you're not a supporter of Taliban, but the fact that we have to almost say this, it shows what point we're at, because we kind of created this position that if you're not for attacking them or forcefully changing the governments, then you're taking their side almost. And it's an absurd logic, but it's been just pushed through for so long. And this was kind of the same logic they used with Iran as well when they attacked the nuclear reactors. The argument was, well, they don't have enough rights for women, and often we exaggerate this. But the whole idea, if you're opposed to attacking them, that means that you are taking the side of the government. But again, it's worth noting that the more or less dictatorship which Iran was run under, this is what created the Islamic Revolution. But if you look at Iran in 79 and 1980 versus now, it's very different. I was there back in May, and I saw people make it sound like a Taliban, but a large percentage of women don't wear the veil, for example. They don't really enforce these laws, and this is what happens over time. If people is left alone, they will pursue the reforms and changes that they want. But when you attack a country, try to blow up, create a nuclear disaster in this country, try to exterminate the country through these decapitation strikes, well, what is going to happen? Well, the government will seize more control. People will see it as their moral duty to follow the government, and suddenly you have the situation which you pretended that you were trying to prevent. It's From my perspective, it's just so contradictory, but we kind of bought into this idea that either you are for, again, it goes into the universal idea, either you're for us transforming the world, remaking it in our liberal democratic eyes through military force, otherwise you're supporting the flawed old world. It's very simplistic and radical, I would say, ideology we have embraced.
Absolutely right. I completely agree with you. In addition to that, we can say that we try to lie to ourselves in order to justify our wars. It's fascinating. In my book on governing by fake news, I talk about Afghanistan and all that. Uh, but in all these conflicts, for instance, you take Iran. You just talked about Iran. Uh, we knew, and we know because the US intelligence has established that since 2003, Iran has not any idea to develop a nuclear bomb. And despite this, and in fact, when Donald Trump was made aware of that, I mean, it was reminded this report of the that was published in March this year from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in the US, Donald Trump said, "I don't care." So he has an intelligence structure that says something, and he does exactly the opposite, and he doesn't care what its own intelligence structure say. We have just a couple of days ago, we had Donald Trump, I mean, the Trump administration or the U.S. government attacking a boat in Venezuela. I don't know if those guys were good guys, bad guys, I don't know. But the whole rationale behind this, including the deployment of ships around Venezuela or in the area in order to exert some pressure on the government, was motivated by this idea that the Venezuelan government supports some gangs, no specific gang that was mentioned by the US administration. Now, you have exactly at the same time, you have a report from the US intelligence saying that there is no relationship between Venezuela and this particular gang. And although this relationship has been stated by the US government as a reason, as a rationale to attack Venezuela. So we see that, and if we talk about Libya, for instance, it happened that during the war that was launched by France and the UK against Gaddafi in 2011, I was in the UN. I was in charge of the policy and doctrine of peacekeeping operations. So we were monitoring the situation very closely. And the whole rationale for the French to intervene in Libya was the so-called massacre that allegedly happened in Benghazi. And at this particular time, we knew at that time that this massacre had not occurred. We knew this. So we used that as a pretext to intervene, although we knew that it was not the case. And coming back to Afghanistan, the whole rationale for attacking Afghanistan was because allegedly Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan. And allegedly, the Taliban didn't want to hand over Osama bin Laden to the Americans. And that's totally true. The Taliban agreed to hand over Osama bin Laden. And there are a huge amount of documents that supports that. They have said, and there have been diplomatic contact between the Taliban at the time and the US administration, the Bush administration, in order to, they declared themselves ready to hand over Osama bin Laden, provided the US provide the proof that he had been involved in the 9/11. The Americans never did that. They never provide the, although they agreed on to make this exchange, to provide the proof, and then Osama bin Laden would be exchanged. But later, they never provide the proof, and they preferred to go to war. So we see that all our wars are in fact based on lies to ourselves, because we know that we are wrong. We have all the information that tells us that we are wrong. And that's something that shocked me, because I come from Switzerland, where obviously we take the word democracy in very high in very high level. And I always said, well, we engage into wars knowing that we are wrong, and then we complain that we have all the consequence of the war, including terrorism, which is the terrorism we had since the year 2001 is the consequence of what we have done in these countries. It is not terrorism is a bad thing, and it has to be fought against. No question about this. But at the same time, we created the condition. We create the opportunities for those guys to make terrorism, not just because they hate us, but because we attacked them. And they see us. Then we as a population in a democracy, we could question also the leverage we have on our governments, because in fact, we accept those wars. Nobody questions the rationale for going to war. Yeah, this is when recently you had on the 5th of March this year, you have Emmanuel Macron, who made a speech to the French population saying that the enemy is no Russia. Russia is ready to attack Western Europe. After Ukraine, it will be us, and things like this. And you had no real reaction in the French population. On the contrary, you had an increase in people in volunteers to join the French army. So people don't even try to, let's say, analyze or assess what the president was saying, which obviously was based on lies, literally. But nobody questioned that. So the whole behind everything we see today and this evolution of the world, the growing gap between our leaders and the population, and the fact that we willingly engage into economic failure and all that, this is the whole thing, the whole issue of democracy, which is at stake here. The way we govern people, that is at stake here. And that's something that I think we haven't really questioned enough, because we try to fight dictatorships and things like that in China, Afghanistan, wherever do we see the authoritarian regime. But are we questioning the way we govern people? Are we questioning the way we engage into wars? Are we questioning the way we conceive international relations? And that's where we see that's the approach that has been promoted, especially by the Russians, because the Russians are obviously in direct contact to Western Europe and in direct contact with this Western European aggressiveness against them. That's why the Russians are so keen to promote security through cooperation. But the Western leadership and even the Western population seem completely immune from this idea of cooperation. And why shouldn't we cooperate with even an authoritarian regime? Because at the end of the day, if we want them to be closer to us, the best way is to have good relations. If we antagonize them, we push them into their corner where they will become more authoritarian. And this is kind of an insane relationship that we have developed now, or not relationship, it's an insane conception of international relations that we have developed in the West. The US does it for its own interest of hegemonic type of mindset. This is part of the US mindset. Not hegemony as such, but this idea that they are the best in the world, they should lead the world, and that they can help the world to be better. That's the mantra. It's a missionary type of mindset that they have since the very beginning of their own existence. And that's why that's how they conquered their own continent, by the way, by trying to impose their own view and this inability to coexist with other, but to this idea that they are better and therefore they should prevail. That's the fundamental mindset, and that's what they do now, but at planet level, if you want. But Europe has probably lost its colonial ambitions after World War II, and instead of understanding that the best way to improve the their own position, but also the rest of the world, is to cooperate with others. And probably that's what we had in the early 60s, 70s, probably, even if you had a lot of anti-colonial conflicts going on at this stage, especially in Portuguese area and things like that. Anyway, we will not discuss that today. In any case, we were probably like that. But since the end of the Cold War, it seems that Europe has engaged in a kind of moralistic, hegemonistic type of behavior that supports, in fact, US policy, not even to the benefit of Europeans, but to the mere benefits of the US, which is extremely strange. And that was exemplified by the recent agreement or so-called agreement that we had between the US and the European Union. So there is here, I think, in the West, a kind of a blindness to what's going on, this inability to understand the world, this inability to understand that other countries may have different way of governing. I always take the example, but that looking at France with the Swiss eyes, for me, France is a monarchy, as even closer to dictatorship than democracy. The only difference being that they can elect their president, but that's all. For the rest, if I see that in Switzerland we vote for every single law, we vote for taxes, we vote for everything, including the procurement of big equipment. I mean, when you buy a large military equipment, this is accepted by the people. So we have an extensive understanding of democracy, and we are just our friend or neighbor just next door. France has a completely different understanding of democracy, and for me, it's closer to a monarchy, an authoritative monarchy, by the way. So why shouldn't we try to topple the French president? You see, if we apply the same rationale, if we consider that our position is the absolute truth and that there is only one way of ruling a country, I would suggest that the only good way is the Swiss way. And then that means that we should topple all other governments. We see it's of course an absurd type of declaration, but it shows how absurd we are also with other countries. We consider ourselves, I mean, the French especially, consider that they are the utmost best of democracy, but they are not, definitely not. And all the demonstrations they have, and eruption of violence they have, and the misery they have, and all that, and all the dysfunctionment they have in their own government. And we have just an example this week. So how come they can pretend to be the best of democracy, and how come are they entitled to decide when other countries should have other type of governance? The Swiss could do that, but certainly not the French. But nevertheless, the French wage war, not Switzerland, even though Switzerland is following now
Well,
when it comes to Ukraine.
it seems to me though that what you're talking about is that well, democracy. It's almost become a political identity. We are democracy because what we do, that's democracy. And it becomes a placeholder for the good guy. And which is why the good guy has the right to criticize and interfere with the bad guy. So it all is very ideological. And I wonder if this is why it's difficult for us to change course, because politics has become was communicated as a marketing campaign. I don't see any serious discussion of key questions. So, for example, what is the most important development in the world today? Well, I would say it's this new multipolar distribution of power. For the first time in centuries, you now have all these many centers of power which are no longer Western. And this means the world's going through a huge change. So, from my perspective, I guess if we ask, how can we preserve the West as a civilization, which we should, uh, how do we do this? And well, to do this, I think we have to ask ourselves an important question, because the West has, for centuries, functioned as a hegemon or a collective hegemon around the world. So the main question we should ask ourselves is, how can the political West sustain itself without being a hegemon? We haven't done this in in centuries. So if we don't, this has to be answered to end the delusions, recognize reality, that is the world as it is. But I find that even asking the question is often interpreted as an affront to the West, almost being anti-Western, even though it's required to save the West, because the West stands for liberal democracy, and to sustain liberal democracy, it has to be rooted in the hegemon. So, so it's the West seems to that we're destroying ourselves and taking us to wars we can't win, simply because we refuse to address very specific, very simple question. That is, how do we maintain the West in a multipolar world where we're no longer dominant? And I just can't see this being answered at all. I'm not sure. Well, if we look at,
No, you're absolutely right. And there is, I can show you this diagram. You probably know the Democratic Perception Index, which is established by, I think it's a Danish or German think tank that makes every year this. It's a democratic perception. So it's not whether a state is democratic or no, but it's the way the people understands or feel like democratic or not. And in 2022, you had this very fascinating diagram here, and you can see on the top. In fact, the idea is they ask people whether they feel they feel who they feel democracy as important. So whether democracy is important or not. And on the other hand, they ask people whether they feel that their own government is um, is in fact implementing democracy, if you want. So it's and that therefore then the delta between the two showed the democratic deficit, and the smallest the deficit is, the biggest is the perception of the democracy. And here it's too small, but I encourage people to go to the website of this, but because it shows in 2000 and in 2022, it changed every year. But in 2022, the two first countries, so where the democracy perception index was the highest, were in fact China in the first place and Switzerland in the second place. And you had France very low on the scale, and even in Russia you had a better. I think Russia is here. It's very small, but you had, of course, Ukraine here, and Russia here. So meaning that the whole issue of democracy is something that is, I mean, obviously you have criteria to measure democracy, and we know certainly that. But beyond this, there is also the way we perceive democracy, the way we perceive our relationship with the government. And the question is, because now we have all these people who think that they have to promote democracy in China and all that. But how come can you promote democracy in a country that feels itself already democratic? And it seems strange to have this kind of perception, but the explanation and the in the study that goes with this diagram, it explains that in China, people, they realize that there's a one-party system, and they probably don't have all the rights that you may have in Switzerland, for instance. But on the other hand, they say, well, I feel that we are in democracy because the government does what is to my benefit. And therefore, the discrepancy between what the government does and what I expect from him is not very it's not very big. And what in France, for instance, people have the impression that there's a huge gap between what the government does and what they expect from the government. And that's how that's who that explains how this diagram must be understood. But that explains how when we start to justify wars with regime change and all that, including what we're witnessing against Russia today, because the whole purpose of this war against Russia, the trade war, the sanctions, and the war in Ukraine, was in fact to provoke this government change in Russia. But that shows how relative this issue of democracy is. And again, I think this diagram, and we can probably question the validity of such an approach. We can discuss that. But nevertheless, it shows that what we consider as democratic in our countries is probably not as the best way to understand how democracy works. And I think that's something that would require more debate, exactly as what you said. I mean, you're right when we say that we have established once for all that we are democratic, and therefore we are the baseline for measuring democracy elsewhere, and that entitles us to wage war everywhere in the world because we are the good guys. And I completely support what you said.
Well, some of these warnings came well in advance, though. That is 2 centuries ago, when Alexis de Tocqueville visited America. He has a chapter in his second bind, which is with the title Democratic Despotism, where he warned that, as you suggested, that we assume that the government represents us. But that was his point as well. If you assume that the government was elected by you, that you assume that it represents you as opposed to their own interest, then you're less likely to oppose it because it rests on that legitimacy. And but also at the same time, he argued that the democracies often hollowed out the substance in order to get people to go along. And I guess, yeah, I just see thing from the perspective here in I'm located in Norway, and I see the government as, for example, their approach to Ukraine. And they use democracy and freedom in every sentence, yet every single representative of parliament is for sending weapons. Nobody thinks we should talk to the opponent. Everyone. This is strange. Every news outlet, every TV channel, newspaper, they say the exact same thing. I see academics. They don't link any of this to NATO expansion. They very cautious to say anything. In private they do. In public, no, they do not speak out. I'm a professor at the university. I criticize NATO's policies because I think they undermine our security. These lunatics, they write articles on the front pages of the largest papers that I'm an agent of Russia because I think that our insistence on expanding NATO is destroying Ukraine. And this makes me anti-Ukrainian, by the way. It's just absurd. This is newspapers. They have government-funded and non-governmental organization who identify as democratic institutions, even though they don't have a democratic mandate. My Wikipedia page looks like a cheap spy novel. I mean, these are authoritarian lunatics, but they are convinced that they're fighting for democracy. Anyone who opposes them, who criticizes their role and the way they're fighting the wars, they're threatening this whole democratic mandate of the West. So they believe that this is democracy, that silencing their opposition, everyone marching in line, this is what democracy has to look like. This is the hegemonic model. It's beyond absurd. It's frightening as well.
I totally agree with you. And the interesting thing is when you talk about NATO and NATO enlargement and NATO, in fact, creating insecurity. When I worked for 5 years in NATO, mandated by my own government under the label of Partnership for Peace, but I was working within NATO. And incidentally, I met an old colleague that I used to work with decades ago when I was at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. And this guy now is in charge of the development, the future development of NATO. And we had a lot of discussion together about NATO, the reality, or let's say I don't find the word, not the reality, but the adequacy of NATO in the geopolitical context of today. And he realized, and he's an American, so he realized that NATO is no longer adequate to respond to the current security context we have. I mean, we had probably today we are back to Cold War, but he realized perfectly that NATO was not adapted to the new context we had in Europe. And probably we should think about a NATO that develops in another kind of model that includes more people and that, in fact, engage much more in cooperative security. And in fact, what struck me at that time is that he was, in fact, closer to the Russian vision of what security in Europe should be. You know, the Russians, I mean, the Soviets in the mid 50s and the Russians in the early 90s uh, suggested their interest of entering NATO. The whole thing of entering NATO was not because they wanted to being part of a military organization as such, but it was somehow they wanted to demonstrate that security cannot be achieved through direct confrontation. And we should, at a certain point, start to be more, the best security is related to the cooperation. If we cooperate together, if we have good relation with each other, that's the best way to achieve security. And today, we have exactly the same approach with the Russians. When we talk about security, I'm jumping a little bit, sorry, but talking to the current issue of security guarantees for Ukraine. The idea of the Russians is not to have two opposing forces that face each other along a demarcation line in Ukraine. Their view of the security guarantee is to have a number of countries that guarantee the security of Ukraine exactly the same way as you had those who guaranteed the security and the neutrality of Switzerland in the early 1800, in 1815 to be precise, during the Vienna Congress that granted neutrality to Switzerland. And that became the model for Austria in 1955. Uh, the guarantee of Switzerland in 1815 was between Germany, Austria, UK, and Russia. By the way, these four powers were guaranteeing the neutrality of Switzerland. In 1955, in Austria, it was the four winners of the the World War II, namely France, Great Britain, UK, US, and Soviet Union. And that's exactly the model, by the way, that was proposed by the Ukrainians in April 2022, based not on the winners of World War II, but based on the members of the Security Council plus others. And that's exactly what the Russians want, because in the Security Council, you have people from both sides of the line, if you want. You have China, Russia on the hand, on the one hand, and you have the France, UK, and the US on the other hand, meaning that they have to talk to each other to guarantee the security of Ukraine, as it was the case during just after the Cold War about Austria, and as it was the case for Switzerland a century before. So, meaning that this understanding of having cooperative security is something that is not necessarily antagonistic to the principle of having a security organization in Europe, even if it's called NATO. The problem is that the current NATO we have, the mindset that has developed in NATO, is in fact is just an extension of what we had during the Cold War, meaning it's a confrontational approach. Means we are always in the mindset of the balance of forces. And we see today that this balance of force is not to the advantage of the West. So therefore, we need to move to something different. And this balance of forces, now we talk about military forces when we talk about NATO, but the balance of force is probably must be understood more generally in economic terms, in political terms, in influence terms. And we see that this balance of force is even more in favor of non-Western, the non-Western world. And I think what the demonstration we have and that's very interesting, by the way, that in China, we had SCO, the meeting of the Security Cooperation Organization, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, sorry, uh, together with the celebration of the 80th anniversary of the victory over Japan, because it shows exactly how the Chinese, I mean, I think the message is very powerful because it shows that security is made of two things: the capacity of waging a war on the one hand, and the capability of doing it, but on the other hand, of the ability of cooperating together. And it's interesting that we had these two events almost in the same week in China. And I think we should learn from this and understand that military force alone cannot guarantee security by itself. It should be, uh, let's say, complemented, supported by effective diplomacy, effective trade relationships, and effective dialogue between people. And that's exactly what the West has failed to do since at least 2022. But in fact, we could even go back to 2014. So this is, I think, we're witnessing today, coming back to your the question you had at the very beginning, what witnessing today is in fact uh, the expression of the two mindsets. One in the West that is just the extension of the Cold War. It's Cold War 2.0 or something like that. Uh, and on the other hand, another part of the world who has understood that we should move a step further and go, they should not abandon the ability to fight, but they should have the ability to dialogue. And that's exactly what they have demonstrated. And I think that's the way to go. Unfortunately, as you rightly said, the problem is that scholars in the West are not even able to understand that, which is quite surprising. Politicians have their political agenda and things like this, and they are probably, most of them are not probably the brightest uh, the brightest brain, so no surprise there. But coming from the academic world, I'm very surprised to see that there's very little thinking about this. This is always a confrontational approach to international relations, and I think that is a little bit depressing. But I don't think that, I mean, again, I don't have the crystal ball. I hope we are not heading towards a full fledged war. But we are probably in some kind of war today. And that's why I come back to my first answer. How do we define war? We are certainly in a war of idea at this stage. Those who think that we should have more cooperation, more understanding of each other, and understand that if we want a better world, this will not come out of the use of force, but it will come out of better understanding and dialogue with each other. And if we want to have governments, I took the example of Afghanistan, but there are probably others. If we want them to be closer to the value we think are better, and again, it's very important to underline that this is the value we think are better, because I have been enough time outside of Europe to understand that values can be understood in different ways, and there are no good and bad values. There are simply different values. And if we want to have people able to talk together, have good relation, and probably improve each other in one sense or the other, the best way is to have dialogue, not confrontation. That's why I'm a supporter of this idea of security by cooperation and not security by confrontation, which is advocated by the West, especially the European Union, and today NATO. But NATO, I would say Mark Rutte more than NATO, because NATO is an organization where decision making is not exactly the same as in the European Union. Anyway, we will not discuss that today.
Well, it's yeah, this is I mean, your main thesis there, that there is possible to make these changes and adjust and find the best path to enhance our own position and security, but you need this openness and dialogue. This is why I think the great curse of our time is that our politicians think it's immoral to talk to the opposing side. You see the same in the media. You see the same in academia, the idea that merely talking to the opponent, putting yourself in their shoes, things which was recognized as the recipe for peace and diplomacy, has now been criminalized under this, I guess, ideological fundamentalism. But yes, Colonel Baud, thank you so much for your time. I always look forward to speaking with you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks.